generation of British composers, a path toward a proudly native school of music, liberated from weighty Teutonic tradition. How did he do it? First and foremost, he drew upon English folk song, at that time a quickly disappearing oral tradition which he and a close circle of friends helped save from extinction. Second, he looked to the choral music of Tudor and Elizabethan composers, from Byrd and Tallis to Henry Purcell. Third, he was attracted to the refined orchestrations of avant-garde French masters Debussy and Ravel. For good measure, this new personal voice included a reverence for the counterpoint of J.S. Bach and a firm knowledge of the techniques of development and transition perfected by Brahms and Wagner. All of these components are found in the London Symphony, a work he would revise many times and eventually call his personal favorite. It was a major turning point in his career and stands today a landmark in the history of British music. Even had Vaughan Williams not given a title to this symphony, those who heard the first performance in London would have instantly recognized several nods to familiar sights and sounds. Because he did call it a London symphony, subsequent audiences assumed the work was programmatic and pestered him for more information. Whereupon he responded, and I quote, "A better title would perhaps be Symphony by a Londoner. The music is intended to be self-expressive and must stand or fall as absolute music." As you listen today, it is perhaps even more useful to remember that the title belongs to a specific time and place. That is, a vibrant and bustling but peaceful pre-war London, as yet untouched by air raids and threats of invasion. In this demonstration, we will point out some of the literal, real-life references to Edwardian London, but also introduce abstract musical elements that place this work in a higher sphere, in similar company with intricately constructed symphonies by giants like Beethoven and Brahms, and explain how those elements contribute to a much richer understanding of the work. In my analysis of this score, the word London is not simply a title for a travelogue about a famous metropolis, but a metaphor for humanity, a symbol for the wealth and breadth of human experiences and emotions which are universal. Hope, tragedy, love, fear, loss, faith, joy, football. Both World Cup and Super Bowl varieties. We begin with identifiable features of the city Vaughan Williams knew and loved. During the slow, rather mysterious opening, which for many evokes the inexorable motion of the River Thames and imagery of a great city awakening to the day, we hear the unmistakable sounds of the Westminster chimes, not in the obvious way one might expect, but in a very subtle, unusual guise. Harp and clarinet sound the familiar tune over a blanket of super soft strings and winds. It is as if we are hearing Big Ben sound the half hour from a distance, faintly, through a dense pea soup fog. Pre-war Londoners were becoming more and more aware of motorized vehicles, but most public transportation still depended upon horses. In the next passage from the second movement, we hear the jingle of horse-drawn, handsome cabs, followed by a plaintive melody played by clarinet and violas. The tune itself reproduces precisely a lavender seller's cry that Vaughan Williams heard and wrote down near his home in Chelsea. orchestration with a then relatively unknown young composer named Maurice Ravel, by 3 years his junior. We can hear Ravel's influence all over this work, but especially so in this striking passage during the third movement, where muted horns and strings are imaginatively conjoined to mimic mouth organ and accordion. The winds follow up immediately with a rollicking tune that evokes the merriment of working class Cockney revels on a Saturday night. While there's no denying these literal atmospheric references, I believe we listen in vain if we suppose that scattered fragments are clues or signposts along a narrative trail. I think there are much larger issues at stake for Vaughan Williams, nothing less than a matter of life and death, to borrow a title from British filmmakers Powell and Pressburger. I contend that underneath a dazzling surface bursting to overflowing with melodic ideas, brilliant orchestration, and reminders of horses and harmonicas, the true program of this symphony involves an elemental struggle of Hegelian proportions, one where seemingly irreconcilable opposing ideas continuously merge and synthesize, setting in motion a cycle of integration and regeneration that is repeated over and over before eventually reaching a new, yet strangely familiar place. In this view, Vaughan Williams is using two contrasting and pervasive musical building blocks, or cells, to represent elemental forces: light and dark, yin and yang, or Hegel's thesis and antithesis. In order to make this intelligible, I'm going to apply the archetypal labels life and death to the two musical building blocks he employs, with the understanding, if you will, that life in this context wears multiple costumes: aspiration, sunlight, humor, sex, football. And death also wears many masks: night, poverty, loneliness, football. The motive attached to life is a two-note interval musicians call a perfect fourth, in this case, a rising perfect fourth. Now don't panic, I'm not going to blind you with a lot of music theory speak. You all know what a rising fourth is. You know it as the end of the first phrase in our national anthem. Oh, say, can you see? That's a rising fourth. For the basic material Vaughan Williams uses to represent death, we musicians use the term chromatic dissonance. You know this term as well. If you've ever tried alternating the black keys and white keys on the piano, or as a curious child, you mashed them together by using the palm instead of your fingers, now you know that you weren't just banging away, you were creating chromatic dissonance. How cool is that? Now we can get started applying these concepts to the London Symphony. When you pay close attention, you will hear the two motives throughout the entire work in hundreds, if not thousands, of different permutations, including entire melodies that are bounded by the narrow compass of a perfect fourth. We're going to demonstrate just a few examples from each movement in order to stimulate and prepare your ear. The very first thing we hear at the start of the symphony is the life motive in the lower strings. As if to reinforce its importance, one rising fourth is stacked upon another, suggesting something like musical accompaniment to the reading of the book of Genesis. The initial appearance of the chromatic death motive arrives with the sudden terrible force of a tsunami, played by the full orchestra. of the opera. Perhaps it will help to explain that Andrew Lloyd Webber is a serial borrower, to use the polite term. Besides luminaries like Vaughan Williams and Puccini, even the mamas and the papas have felt Lord Lloyd Webber's light fingers. Earlier, I mentioned the strong influence of English folk song in Vaughan Williams' music. By the time he wrote a London symphony, he had so completely absorbed the essence of folk song that their essential elements are completely integrated within the original tunes in this work. With one exception, the Lavender Seller's Cry we heard earlier, all of the melodies in this symphony, big and small, are original. Near the beginning of the second movement, the English horn plays a haunting folk-like melody, which features the rising forth life motive twice, in the first upward leap and again toward the end of the melody. Elsewhere, in the same movement, the rising forth motive is rendered in very pure, unadorned fashion by the solo horn, as it emerges from the stillness created by gently pulsating strings. It is a remarkably poignant moment in the symphony, plangent and perhaps nostalgic. Next, the life motive, but now in stark contrast to what we just heard, is heard as the climax of a full-throated, soaring melodic line played by the violins. The mood is transcendent and ecstatic, and it must remain for the individual listener to decide whether such passion is spiritual or physical in nature. As you will quickly realize, legions of Hollywood composers have gone to the Vaughan Williams well whenever they were asked to score a biblical epic. You see Charleton, Heston? Between the two previous examples, a brief eruption of the death motive occurs, less violent than before, but still disturbing. Again, you will hear the downward falling motion of a chromatic scale, the dissonance less intense, gradually dissipating. Moving now to the third movement, marked scherzo. Here is a more mundane example of the life motive. Now a cheerily uplifting rising forth used repetitively, almost as a kind of melodic filler, helping to propel the music forward in keeping with the boisterous gaiety of a night out in the capital. In the final movement, you will hear an increasing number of passages that connect, juxtapose, and combine both of these motives. Several, like the next example, effectively achieve a synthesis of the two opposing ideas. While chromaticism death dominates the first half of this passage, listen for the slightly altered rising forth in the second half. Vaughan Williams' most original and lasting contribution to the symphony, that is to the historic development of the genre, is his adoption of a concluding epilogue, a kind of summation and commentary concerning all that has come before. In the epilogue, Vaughan Williams returns most insistently to the life motive as we heard it in the very beginning, but now transformed into what? Redemption, acceptance, resignation, it is unclear. Nearing the very end, in this our final example, we hear a solo violin float upwards as though let loose from its earthly bounds. The final step it takes before reaching a sublime peak is to sound the last rising forth we will hear in the piece. As the violin sustains a single note high above, a faint echo of death, played by muted brass, is heard below. As you listen to this marvelous work in full, I ask you to recall my earlier references to an intellectual construct associated with the philosopher Hegel, in which seemingly irreconcilable opposites continuously engage and create synthesis, setting in motion a cyclical pattern of integration and regeneration that must lead inevitably to a new but strangely familiar resolution. I will leave you with a different version of the same idea as expressed by a contemporary of Vaughan Williams. In his celebrated poem, The Wasteland, T.S. Eliot wrote, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." And now a London Symphony by Vaughan Williams.